Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Enemies in the Server Racks, How BMC Vulnerabilities Became Critical Infrastructure Threats. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to just go over a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording the session, and we will make a copy of the slides as well as a link to the recording available to you by tomorrow. If you have any questions during the session, please go ahead and throw them into the Q&A chat, and we will try to address them either in real time or save some time at the end for addressing questions. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. I'm joined with Paul Azadorian, who is our Principal Security Researcher here at Eclipsium, and he is joined by Wes Dobry, who is our VP of Solution Engineering. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to both of you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Thanks everyone for joining. Wes, good to see you as always.
Same.
Uh, Today we're talking about enemies in the server rack, BMC vulnerabilities, and how they became mission critical infrastructure threats for sure. I think it's something, Wes, that you and I, and many of us at Eclipsium have always believed for some time that BMCs represent a pretty scary attack surface. And it's exciting to dig into some of the history behind it. And more importantly, talk about what we're going to do about these vulnerabilities and threats that we'll talk about today. So we'll start with what is a baseboard management controller. Probably could to define some terms. I added some content in there. It's based on a white paper that we did in conjunction with AMI, where we really dug into the vulnerability landscape. So we'll cover that a little bit. We'll talk about, in general, major BMC vulnerabilities. I think many of them have been discovered and disclosed by Vlad Babkin, our illustrious, one of our illustrious researchers here at Eclipsium. Um, then we'll talk about the first BMC vulnerability in the SysACEV, which is it's interesting. It's exciting, but like I get excited when attackers exploit vulnerabilities that I think are cool. But obviously, if you're on the defensive side, that's not cool. So we'll talk about BMCs also in AI data centers, and then of course how to protect yourselves against BMC attacks. So baseboard management controllers. I always like to frame this as you liked computers so much that I put a computer inside your computer because it's essentially what a BMC is. And if you like Linux and you like ARM processors and you're buying mostly servers, you get one of those inside of your server as well. So most of as you'll see from our research, right, most of the BMCs today I'd say most of them are A-speed, Wes, running
Mhm.
ARM processors, running some flavor of Linux, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's pretty common across whether you've got Dell, Lenovo, HP, like whatever your servers are, like most of them are that platform, and most of them are based on OpenBMC.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting part there that when we think about BMCs, whether you call it a BMC or you'll see other proprietary terms out there like ILOs, iDRACs as well.
Hmm.
Long and short of it is if you have power to that server, this thing's up and running. And
Right.
we'll get into some of the other idiosyncrasies of these things, but it's always an interesting scenario to think about that this is a computer inside the computer that gives full management to the computer as if you were standing in front of it. So, when we think of it from that side of things as we go through here and talk about some of these vulnerabilities and such, oftentimes these are overlooked components of our critical infrastructure where we've taken in for granted that they haven't necessarily been an attack vector. But as time shifts and we get further into it, these devices are getting more and more important to our ecosystem.
Yeah, this technology's been around for a while. I, want to say 25 years ago when I was helping rack and stack a Windows environment at a university that I worked for, that I was like, wow, that's cool. It's got like a little embedded controller in there and it has a separate Ethernet. And I'm like, well, we really need to protect those. We need to use those to build these systems because that was at the time when if you put an unpatched Windows system on a network, it was owned by some piece of network worm or we called them worms back then, right? And I was like, wow, we can utilize the basically out of band management for this, but I'm like, we also have to protect that. So there is a huge use case for sysadmins. Like this is a very useful feature. We had similar controllers where we could remote in and power cycle the machines, rebuild the operating system, get a console. So from a sysadmin perspective, it's very useful. However, it's in a whole other attack surface that's inside of your server.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember back in the day, the first time I worked on a system that had a BMC, and I was so excited. I was like, oh, I don't have to do magic packets and wake
Yeah,
online anymore and
right.
all of this stuff. And I can just get as if, I was connected to it and I didn't have to connect to a KVM or anything. If you want to go to the next slide for me,
Yeah.
it's interesting because now when you start to look at this stuff and you see that these things are built off of things like OpenBMC and as Paul said, using ARM processors, um, each manufacturer kind of builds from the same baseline and
Hmm.
are doing their own customizations against it. But that also means that because there is that standardized approach and that core of it when something's found in that core, it also now applies to many, many of the major manufacturers out there that we're using within our server infrastructures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, most of them, like we said, are based on OpenBMC. Actually, as part of this project, so we have a white paper that looks at this is the one I was talking about that looks at that vulnerability landscape within BMC is primarily focused on OpenBMC based implementations, which Intel, IBM, Supermicro, AMI all use OpenBMC as their base. There's kind of a long lineage, Wes, you talked about ILO and iDRAC. I don't know like at what juncture they started adopting OpenBMC, but I know a lot of those technologies have changed over time. And vulnerabilities have been associated with like previous revisions, and then some in the middle, and then more recent ones. Especially like you said, if there's a vulnerability in OpenBMC, it's a supply chain issue, right? Because you've inherited that code. Also, if you look at OpenBMC, there's a lot of components. Like we think of this as a small little embedded thing. There's a lot of code inside of there. As an exercise as part of this project, I actually built and compiled OpenBMC from scratch. It uses a build technology and framework called Yocto, and it actually was the only process that really taxed all 24 cores on my computer. I have like a Threadripper here at home. And normally, like everything kind of hums along, like I've got plenty of compute. But when I did this Yocto build, it really took advantage of the cores and was a large package to compile. It took some time, even on my really fast system. And that speaks to just the sheer amount of lines of code and different components in OpenBMC, which opens up a lot more attack surface. Um,
Yeah. And it's funny that you're talking about using the Octo for the build process, and I mean that's what a lot of embedded Linux systems use
yeah.
as their build processes. And when you start looking at the hardware components that go into a baseboard management controller, and you see that it's a full ARM Cortex, and it has,
Hmm.
oftentimes, let's say between 4, 8, and even sometimes I've seen 16 gig of RAM in these things now, for the BMC itself, and you're like, wow, that is a full system
Yep.
running within there that is doing nothing more than basically monitoring some logging interfaces and serial peripheral interface and making some commands to and from the hardware itself and you're like wow this is a almost a full server like I've deployed thin clients with less hardware than
Yeah.
that over the years.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons for this paper is to highlight the importance of security on BMC controllers because they have tentacles into all of the hardware, right? In order for the BMC to allow an administrator to remotely install an operating system, configure things out of band, it has like these tentacles basically into all of the hardware, representing like the highest privilege level within the system because it's separate from the system, but has maintained all of that access to all of the components, hardware, inside of the running server. There's this now old TV show on Amazon called The Feed. I don't know if everyone's ever seen it, but it's a sci-fi TV series where the implant in your brain is like your smartphone, basically, and you can't take it out because it's so ingrained in your brain. I look at BMCs as the same thing. It's like that piece of technology that's really ingrained in the system that has a very high level of privilege. So certainly go check out the white paper. It's really it's a good read in terms of understanding where vulnerabilities stem from, how to track them, and what each manufacturer and different build, like how they're doing in terms of the number of vulnerabilities that exist inside of largely all of this open source software. So there's been a pretty storied history of BMC vulnerabilities. We trace this back to 2003. IPMI was certainly very popular as one of the, it probably still is, right, in terms of a management protocol that allows you to manage these BMCs. It was replaced by Redfish, which is more of an API implementation, and both IPMI and Redfish allow you over the network to manage your BMCs, kind of similar to the way you'd use SNMP to configure your network infrastructure. These protocols allow you to interact with and configure your BMC. So IPMI was not designed with security in mind and has had a very long history of vulnerabilities, significant ones happening in 2003. Fast forwarding to 2019, we had some interesting vulnerabilities with really, funny name, cloudborne and pants down vulnerabilities that speaks to when you've got a cloud provider that has provisioned a whole bunch of compute gear. They're managing that gear largely through BMCs. And if an attacker would get to the BMC layer, there could be opportunities for an attacker to jump into other systems within the cloud environment. Wes, I don't know if you have more insights or experience with the pants down vulnerabilities or the cloud-borne.
Yeah, so Cloudboard was our own research that we did, and ultimately that paper kind of went into how you could go from host OS into BMC, laterally move within BMC, and effectively scale to being able to take out an entire data center. And the way that most of us over the years have architected our management infrastructure within a data center is a lot of times your BMCs exist within something like a single VLAN. You have your management network, so to speak. And
Hmm.
there's no segregation between those things. We're not doing PV LANs, we're not doing,
Hmm.
other ways of protecting those BMCs from being able to talk to each other. And Cloudborne was the research that showed if you go into that BMC, escalate or exploit it, and then implant it and then are able to go and talk on that management interface, suddenly now you have lateral movement to other privileged segments. Around the same time, or maybe in the 2022 there were the vulnerabilities that then allowed things like authentication bypasses and escalations of privilege within it. Suddenly you had a recipe where you had some kind of an initial vector that got them in there, whether that was coming from the operating system of the device and exploiting an IPMI driver, or just simply having access to that management network segment. And a lot of times, these were not seen as super critical. They were behind an authentication, and everyone said, "Okay,
Hmm.
this is fine to let other corporate devices talk to it." But then once you start throwing things like an unauthenticated authentication bypass into escalation of privilege, into lateral movement, you now have the capability where, nothing more than a script kiddie could theoretically completely own every server in the data center now at this point. And so, that really started down the path of this journey where these devices have steadily risen in criticality.
Yeah, and Vlad showed a lot of those vulnerabilities and the possibilities for what you can do when you exploit them with three different disclosures totaling five vulnerabilities that we called BMC and C parts one, two, and three. And in there are code execution and authentication bypass vulnerabilities that have been fixed. And we'll get to, remediation, but obviously you want to make sure you apply patches for those. As I've studied some of I'll actually show you some of the nuclei templates and walk you through a little bit of the exploits. Pretty fascinating. NVIDIA's research team discovered like 9 or 10 vulnerabilities. I have a link to that paper in there too. So that was interesting. NVIDIA Bluefield DPU. What are Bluefield DPUs, Wes?
So So DPU, I'm drawing a blank on exactly what the acronym means for. It's like data processing unit or something like
Hmm.
that. They're effectively data center accelerator cards, 400 gig cards for network interface to other devices, so that you can get effectively memory to memory kind of speeds between them.
Hmm.
Most of the time, these are used for your AI training and things like that to accelerate server to server communications over protocols and technologies similar to InfiniBand.
Hmm.
And so, these devices and simply smart NICs, as they're called, are so critical to one, the performance of these systems at scale, that they themselves have their own baseboard management controllers in them to manage the clusters that
Wow.
they're put into. So, now we're talking about, you've got a server with a CPU and memory, and then you've got GPUs in it or other kind of cards for AI training, and then you've got a NIC that's effectively bridging the memory and the processor of this device to memory and processor of other systems. And it's so critical, it has its own BMC within it so that it
Hmm.
can be managed. So, we're now, it's no longer as a server, a single entity. A server and the components of a server are being managed as part of clusters where now these systems are, entire racks or entire rows or even entire NOCs within our environments, where these things are super high criticality, super well connected. And if one piece of that puzzle fails, you have significant amounts of processing time and such that could be impacted when, you know,
Right.
if one of these single Bluefield BMCs or Bluefield DPUs were affected.
Um, and then in 2025, we had the vulnerability that Vlad disclosed and discovered and disclosed that was added to the CISA KEV. So we did see attackers in the wild exploiting this vulnerability. I'll walk you through a little bit about that. Dennis brings up a great question of all these vulnerabilities. Are there CPEs? The CPEs get very confusing. It's one of the things that make navigating vulnerabilities on BMCs extremely difficult because the CPEs will sometimes include strings of all the different ILO versions. Sometimes it'll be super micro. Sometimes it'll be AMI Mega Rack, which is a product that would be implemented by super micro. So a lot of the terminology has really clouded the CPEs. I did not have good luck just pulling, CPE strings
Yeah.
to analyze all the vulnerabilities associated with BMC? It's a great question, Dennis.
And the other thing regarding CPEs with it is oftentimes, our industry is moving in a way where devices should not be able to be fingerprinted over a network. And because of that, you're having to move to, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but move to technologies that can actually authenticate and then fingerprint the device so that you can actually get a correct
Mhm.
product and version information to map that to these vulnerabilities and map that to these potential risks.
Sometimes you don't need a vulnerability. You can exploit configuration and credentials and really any system, right? And where that applies to BMC is kind of a funny story. A long time ago when I was a penetration tester, I got on a customer site and I believe it was an iDRAC BMC that was on the regular network, not separated from the rest of the network that I was able to connect to. It either had default or easily guessable credentials to log into the BMC. And on the BMC, you can get a virtual console to what's happening on the actual server running the operating system in production. And when I connected to the virtual console, really just by clicking the launch button, like it was very similar to this web interface from what I can remember, and it dropped me into a root shell on the system. And so, my contact for the pen test comes over. It's like the first 20 minutes of the pen test, and he sees me sitting in a root shell. He's like, "Wow, that cannot be good." I'm like, "Well, here's what happened." He's like, "Oh, like we need to get these off the network and segmented right away and put some good credentials on there as well." So,
Yeah, so on that topic, one of the major areas that I've always found in environments when I've gone in and done assessments is, a lot of times if you have, let's just say, a junior person that hasn't dealt with servers and BMCs, they may not know to disable the capability for that BMC to ride on the primary Ethernet interface. So if you can,
Yeah.
NIC 0, that NIC will actually end up pulling two IP addresses. One is the host and the host's
hmm
OS, and the other is actually a ride-along BMC interface for a shared management network. So you could end up now on your server network, wherever that device was plugged into, you now have the BMCs on that as well. Um,
Right.
so that's also something if you're looking at for locking this stuff down, confirming that that shared management network is disabled and it's using its own physical
hmm
interface or physical or VLAN.
So CVE 2024-54085 was the authentication bypass in affecting AMI Megarec redfish management interfaces, which is like an API that rides along in Megarec implementation. It's written in Lua. It implements an API framework for you to interact with. And Vlad discovered authentication bypass in there, and then that was observed being exploited in the wild, and that's the vulnerability 2024-54085. And this vulnerability is very interesting because it's very easy to exploit. Um, I've looked at a lot of exploits and vulnerabilities out there on a weekly basis, and some are super complex, and this one is not. It's basically a host header spoofing that allows you to. It's kind of a weird. We talked about it on the podcast, right? It's kind of a weird class of vulnerability, but does allow an attacker to. In the example code for that Vlad had published was it allows me to create an account on the BMC. You could do other things, but the example we had was I connect to the Redfish API, I bypass authentication, and then I issue commands through that API to create an administrator account for myself, where then I can log in and do whatever I want on the BMC. And so also Vlad's had some interesting impact examples. One of them that Vlad has not released is very, very scary to me, and that is if you can execute code on the BMC as an attacker, you can configure it so that it just constantly reboots the system and never loads the operating system and never loads the management interface for the BMC. And doing that early, it means your server's rebooting and short of physically unplugging it and resorting to physical means, it can be really hard to recover. So this would be a doomsday scenario in ransomware or just an attack that wants to take down infrastructure could be very destructive if that malicious code can get inside the BMC.
Yeah, so I played around with that on one of my servers here at the
hmm
house, and you can set scheduled tasks within there, and I basically set a scheduled task at power on to power off, and
Right.
and I ended up in a scenario where if I thought about it, if I had access to the Redfish APIs, which this authentication bypass gives you, I create my own account, I change the password on all existing accounts, and I remove any third-party authentication providers.
hmm
Now, the only way that if I did a scheduled task like that, that I could get back into that system is by opening up the server and changing a header to force a reset of the config on that system,
Right.
that
Right.
BMC.
Yep.
Um, and that was a crazy scenario for me because I literally almost ended up locking myself out of my own server with that
Hey,
same thing.
you're
Uh,
pretty brave playing with that, Wes.
well, part of it is if I did break it, I have a feeling I know the guys that could help me fix it. So,
Right. Right. Very, very true. So we did release nuclei templates. Of course, we have coverage in our product. But because this was such a critical issue and because it was added into the CISA KEV, I really pushed for them, like, we got to help the community out. We got to give people some tools to be able to discover and accurately test for these vulnerabilities. And we actually released two nuclei templates to test for two different vulnerabilities. This is the one for the CVE that ended up on the CISA KEV. Um, and it's pretty basic, right? It goes in and it hits the Redfish API, make sure that the Redfish API responds with some kind of status code like 200 to say, oh, it's actually responding to me and not giving me a 404 or 403. And then it uses the X server ADDR address. And once it sets that host, that header in the HTTP request, the BMC believes that these requests are coming from inside the system, the calls coming from inside the house. And those calls from inside the system, which essentially we're spoofing, are not authenticated. So through this header value, we're able to bypass authentication and then run commands. And so this nuclei template will help you test for that. There's instructions, you can see it here on how to run the nuclei template, and they're published on that blog post. So if you want to go hunting and you think you might have servers that are vulnerable to this, this is a great way to kind of get started on it. We talked about BMCs and AI data centers already. There's Bluefield 2 and 3, and these are the high performance cards they're not network cards, right, Wes? You describe them as almost like in a supercomputer environment, bridging CPU and memory between systems.
Yeah. And the important part here is that this vulnerability exists specifically in IPMI tool, which is effectively the conduit from the BMC back into the OS. So,
Yeah.
most of us have worked with virtualized environments where we had things like guest software that interface to the hypervisor itself. IPMI tool is effectively the same thing for the BMC to be able to go and do things like, let's say, map a CD-ROM within the operating system and have everything work. These vulnerabilities actually allowed code execution through that channel. So now you had a privileged capability within the operating system from the BMC. So it didn't matter how secure that host OS was if you had the IPMI drivers and the tool installed in the host OS. You could now, using these vulnerabilities, exploit and do code execution within the OS at a privileged level. So obviously this is a crazy kind of scenario because now if you think of, some of the things that we've talked about being able to move between these things because they likely aren't
Mhm.
segregated between them. If you have capabilities to get into them and or um, if increase your privilege, escalate privilege, and then now you have code execution within the OS, like there's no more barriers between just,
Right.
doing anything on that system, both from a physical hardware perspective and within the operating system itself. So, remaining persistent in that environment now spans the hardware, the
Mhm.
BMC, the host OS, lateral movement within the environment. I mean, it's just crazy when you start putting these vulnerabilities together.
Yeah, this is part of a trend that I'm observing, and partly it's our own research. If those that are listening today happen to check out our blog and see the bad cam research, this is essentially an attacker can put malicious code and control the Linux-based firmware on a webcam, independent of the operating system. Cisco Talos researchers proved the very similar or the same capabilities that could be done on, was it Dell's Control Vault plane that exists in over 500 models of Dell servers. And last year's Black Hat, we talked about option ROMs, right? Small pieces of software on peripherals. They get loaded into early stages of UEFI as basically a driver. Those could be malicious. And so, like, the trend I'm seeing in research is as an enabling attackers to hide in these other components outside the operating system. Not only do I think that's interesting research, but it's very concerning as we get better at protecting the operating system. Attackers are going to move to different areas and change their TTPs to go, okay, well, how do we get around that? Well, if I can just live somewhere outside of the operating system in a peripheral, in a BMC, that's way better because we don't have great visibility into these devices. I'm not running an EDR on my BMC inside of my server because it's a very locked down and tight environment. I'm not able to do that, which also limits my visibility. Attackers know that, and that's where they're going to try and live and hide. So NVIDIA's researchers published an outstanding paper. This was just a great read and fantastic research. 9 proof of concept exploits that were targeting BMC software. So, certainly I think this is proving a couple of things. One, BMC software has vulnerabilities just like any other firmware or software. Researchers like ourselves and folks at NVIDIA are looking at these and discovering a number of vulnerabilities, right? I think Vlad's got at least five under his belt. NVIDIA's got nine, and these are recent. These are within the last year that we're uncovering these vulnerabilities in modern stacks for BMCs. So this is a great read. You should go read it. It just further underscores the kind of ripe threat landscape that exists in BMCs today. So we did talk a little bit about the impact of BMCs already. Um, but again, I think that the persistent and really, really deep level that an attacker can get into BMC, bears repeating. That enables attackers to potentially, because I can't say this with 100% certainty in all cases. However, as we all know, there's a lot of protections that are built into both the hardware, the firmware, and the software, like the operating system, that attempt to prevent attackers from getting in those early stages, right? Secure boot being the most obvious one, building a root of trust so that we can't implant malicious software into software firmware drivers that are involved in the boot process. However, if an attacker compromises the BMC has access above and beyond a lot of that other hardware on the system, which means as an attacker, I can potentially disable secure boot or circumvent technologies like secure boot because I have access to the BMC.
Well, I mean, even in that regard, the latest generations of BMCs, you can actually manage root of trust and, things
Hmm.
like your oh, what are they called? The machine
Uh,
keys and those things
yeah,
within Secure Boot itself. And so if you're using, let's say third-party drivers as part of your Linux kernel that you've had to go and add into Secure Boot so that they're trusted,
a
you could
mock list is what you're looking
mock
for.
list is what I
Yep,
was thinking of. Yeah. You could simply reset that mock list from the BMC, and then guess what? The server no longer boots. So I mean,
right.
these are insignificant in the grand scheme of things, changes that can impact the complete operation of that system.
Hmm. Yeah, and I like the persistence model here, because this is similar to the webcam research. I may, as an attacker, persist outside of this operating system. And what that means is I could completely rebuild the operating system, including my boot partition or my GPT partition, right? I could do a complete wipe of everything. I mean, in this scenario, I could wipe my spy flash where UEFI lives, put a fresh UEFI on there. But if an attacker is persisting in a webcam or inside of a BMC, once that operating system comes back up, that reinfection can happen. It's one of the things that kind of scares me and keeps me up at night is this access vector that allows an attacker to just constantly reinfect, making it super difficult to kick that attacker out of my systems and my network. We talked a little about the lateral movement, and it's interesting. This has been a thing for a long time. I was speaking to a security researcher who looked at BMCs 10 plus years ago, and it's the same thing. And I think he said the same thing, Wes, that we're saying, right? That compromising one BMC, if they're all on the same network and there's no protections, I can just keep jumping into from a BMC into another system, right? And that then gives me access, a very high level of privileged access to all of the infrastructure in an organization, which is a bad day. And then we did talk about physical damage. So there are papers, and I'm not entirely certain BMCs could be a conduit to this, but I believe that to be true. But there are papers that talk about if a malicious threat actor were to gain access to some of these hardware pieces, such as a BMC, to be able to actually cause physical damage above and beyond what we were talking about earlier, actually like fry and brick the server. And there are papers that talk about that. Fortunately, I've
Yeah.
never seen that in the wild, but it has been proven, and I've talked to all the research. I'm like, is this real? Is this possible? Like physics, and my researcher friends are like, no, it's totally possible.
Mhm.
Totally, like we've tested, like totally possible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I've seen BMCs that give capabilities to things like memory timings and such that'll take effect
Hmm.
on the next power cycle of the system. Nowadays, BMCs also have ITAD use cases built into them, so IT asset disposition use cases. So that's your secure wipe and such like that. So you can literally trigger that the system powers off and starts, doing a DoD wipe on all the drives on it and all the storage, resetting everything back to factory defaults and reapplying the latest firmware update to the system and overriding existing things. You can do that from the BMC.
Yeah.
And if we're thinking about this from an attack chain perspective, we've talked about initial access to these things. If we're getting in access on Redfish, to jump to literally decommissioning and wiping the server is, the effect of one or two API calls. So that could be done in, let's say a tenth of a second from the time that you get
Right.
access to the system.
I just hope attackers aren't thinking about that. That's it's a very scary scenario.
Mhm.
So getting an inventory of your BMCs, why is that challenging, Wes, in your experience?
Yeah, so it's about maintaining that inventory. You can look at servers and say, "Oh, I bought these servers. They have this kind of a BMC on it," and you can throw that in your asset inventory. But maintaining that is one thing. The manufacturers generally provide tools to aggregate this stuff together, but oftentimes those are not free tools, nor are they relatively inexpensive. So
Right.
a lot of the environments out there that are not spending tremendous amounts of money on a per OEM tool to manage this stuff at scale, they end up just managing these things independently. If I'm a doctor's office with 5 to 10 servers, I'm not using a tool that gets me a single pane of glass for what I have for BMCs.
Hmm.
And that also means that I'm also probably not updating these things very often. So, I don't know one, probably where they are. I don't know their IP addresses unless I cataloged a static IP for them. And I'm also not, watching them from a risk perspective.
Right. Yeah, and also many larger organizations don't have just one OEM.
Mhm.
And while one, OEM A may have a great tool for managing their stuff, and I don't want to knock them for that, but now I've also got OEM B, and that tool doesn't work with that. So either I need another tool, or like you said, what most people do is they start rolling their own management and inventory system for
Mhm.
BMCs.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that oftentimes, we have a hard enough time with configuration management across our servers alone, let alone the management infrastructure for them. Even things like I've had servers that have been deployed for a year, had a weird thing on it, and then found out that the port, had multiple VLANs and was causing some kind of a weird network thing. And I'm like, how did this server one get deployed this way? And two,
Mm,
how has it stayed that way this whole time and no one noticed?
right.
And this is in enterprises where you have all these tools and you still have things that are funky out there. That's the challenge, is especially like in this situation. I'm so glad that we generated and you shared those nuclei templates to have companies to actually look at this stuff and start taking a look at it. Because if they're not doing that, then it's trivial at this point with the research that's been publicly available,
Mm.
to take advantage of these things.
Yeah, and again, this is an area of visibility that's usually pretty poor in terms of getting logs or any kind of telemetry or information from a BMC. Wes, have you ever had luck like pulling logs or getting better visibility out of the BMCs? Or does it, I imagine it varies per manufacturer.
Yeah, so you generally get SNMP traps.
Hmm.
You generally can go and do things like syslog from it, so you can, centralize your authentications and session information through your
Hmm.
syslog and or SNMP. But the visibility side of it is that, yeah, sure, you might see a login with an account that you already know about, and that's going to look like normal traffic. Because
Hmm.
a lot of places don't even do things like service accounts, or in some cases, SAML or OAuth into these things. They're using the default account with a pre-generated password because it's written
Hmm.
on a card on the front of the server. Um,
Right.
so, when you see that, administrator with a capital A account sign in, you go, oh, okay, that's legitimate. But Well, the challenge is a couple of these vulnerabilities give the capability to then run code within that. And that's to your point about visibility here. I loved what you said about we're not putting EDRs on our BMCs, if
Right.
and these things are Linux. So if you get into them, you get root and you throw, let's say a reverse shell into it that's listening on that same management interface that's running within the BMC. Let's say even if it's not persistent, you're not restarting your BMCs at any regular intervals. That reverse shell
Right.
stay there in
For a
effectively
long, yeah.
perpetuity.
Well, I think Mickey showed a interpreter payload running on the webcam. And
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that same payload could run, it's Linux on ARM. That could run on your BMC as well. I guess that gets into how you want to restrict network access
Mhm.
as well. You probably don't want them reaching out to the internet. Now that I think about that interpreter shell running on there, if you restrict outgoing access, that's a good thing to do as well.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this along a number of different of our webinars that we've done around things like in these kinds of segments where we have privileged devices like the management interfaces of BMCs or the management interfaces of network gear. If there's any outbound traffic occurring, that needs to flag bells and whistles,
Right.
and everyone needs to go and jump on that because if I have a BMC that tries talking out to something, whether it's another BMC or into my corporate network segments or something, or out to the internet, like you said, that right there should raise some of the highest red flags inside of a company.
Yeah. Yeah, because the firmware updates are not automatic. You have to push the firmware updates to them, which again, when we speak about patch lag, that's usually due to the supply chain. I'll use AMI as an example because we gain insights. They do a great job in squashing vulnerabilities. That's one thing I learned in working with the team at AMI is they are very diligent about going, we want the least number of vulnerabilities, so they're constantly pushing out patches. However, in that supply chain, I may customize what AMI has given me. This is true in UEFI as well. And then when I have to pull the patch in, now I've got to retrofit those pieces together. I've got to, as the vendor, the OEM, I've got to take the new patch. I got to make sure it works with my modifications. I got to test all of that. Then I have to package it up and I have to push it out to the end user or enterprise who's adopted my server technology. And so, similar to UEFI, BMC kind of suffers from that, just the nature of the supply chain. AMI, we did a podcast interview with AMI yesterday with Brian Mullen, and they're working on ways to increase that cycle to make things easier. They understand that that lag is there, and they want to help reduce that as best they can. So, but right now there may be some lag on patches. So. One of the things that's funny, this kind of stems from uh, whenever I am reading the coverage about BMC vulnerabilities in popular press, cybersecurity news sites, right? There's always people in the comments and the people who write the articles that are like, well, just don't expose your BMC to the internet. And they're like, oh, well then like, you're done. Like I'm done. We can go home now, right? Like I love the meme because like I don't always enable remote access, but I do expose it to the internet. Now there are about, I don't know, 3 to 5 thousand BMCs that we can confirm that are exposed to the internet. But the advice just tends to be like, oh, this isn't a big deal because you just shouldn't expose them to the internet. So, all we need is a firewall and now we can all go home because we know how to protect our BMCs. Um, but it turns out you need more than just the firewall, Wes, to protect your BMC. So I'll turn it over to you to start talking about some of the defensive mechanisms.
Yeah, yeah. So I always love that with that thought process of, oh yeah, well we just won't expose this to the internet. We'll just throw it behind a firewall, and only administrator computers can access it and things like that. And long and short is we all know that's just simply not enough.
Mm,
The sheer fact that when we even think about how we protect servers in general, we limit access to them. We have, bastion hosts to allow us to, or jump boxes to get into these privileged network segments. Or, in some cases, if you're in an organization that's fortunate enough, you have full software defined networking that's doing complete ACLs into everything on these systems. And I mean, these are kind of the same principles that need to be applied to BMCs to protect against their own compromise. Obviously the first step is you got to know what you have out there, and that's, getting an inventory of those BMCs that exist, how they're connected to the network, what their configurations look like. I say in here, it starts with S bombs, F bombs, and H bombs. So software bill of
Mm-hmm.
materials, firmware bill of materials, and hardware bill of materials. Although I'm a little bit partial to the F bombs there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but part of this is, using things like that nuclei template before just to go and be watching for these vulnerable ones. Regular network scanning to identify anything that may have popped in there, as well as just making sure that your CMDBs are completely up to date for, what the BMC information is for every one of your systems. Because, nowadays, pretty much every server is going to have a BMC in it. And the next step is really getting visibility towards what's actually happening within them. First part is monitoring and doing change control on the configurations within them. Setting up your logging, having syslog, SNMP traps set up, going to your SIM, starting to monitor them for change. Because if you have a configuration change done by an administrator that's not logged in your change control, well, that could be something of note that you need to be concerned with. It also goes into the network communications of those. We talked a little bit earlier about monitoring for outbound communications from these things. The only thing that these things should be talking to are likely your SIM for log aggregation and alerts and events. They should be talking to your authentication subsystems and providers so that you can do centralized authentication and again, having the auditing components of those things. They shouldn't be talking to each other. This is a great aspect for software-defined networking, PV LANs, and similar to complete isolation between every one of these BMCs. They shouldn't have direct access to them. I am a huge proponent of using orchestration systems that exist out there to manage these BMCs at scale so that you don't have a human that touches them from a network perspective. This is the direction I'm going with a lot of enterprise management of devices, that these things should be managed by an orchestrator and not a human, and no
Yeah.
human should have direct access to them. Same thing goes with the authentication side of it, is that, maybe your environment should not have any known users and passwords for these things, and you should only have a service account that you can check in, check out that's regularly rotated, or, some sort of SAML or OAuth perspective to get access to these devices.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't solve the reduction of risk on these things by standard patching and mitigation of these vulnerabilities. You still need to do vulnerability management on these things, which means that you need to have your vulnerability management system capable of identifying the vulns in these systems. And then as soon as the vulns exist, you either need to mitigate, put in a compensating control, isolate, or patch if one's available. But to Paul's point earlier, you'll hear about these vulns, and then it may be weeks, months before that patch is released for your OEM for your server version, if it's done at all. That's been an interesting part, is that if the system's out of life, which, or end of life, I should say, you end up in scenarios where the manufacturer is not required to patch it anymore. And guess what? That BMC doesn't get patched. You're still vulnerable after that. And now you have an authentication bypass that exists in your network that you can't do anything about. Which really brings it to the last part, is the detection of attack. Monitoring those logs, access logs, change control for tampering, implants, malicious traffic, all of these different things, so that you have the full picture of what that BMC is doing. So now I'll talk a little bit about what Eclipsium does for this, because as you guys can probably imagine, this is an area where we play and where we help organizations to do it. So we focus on exactly this side of building trust in enterprise hardware. Now, I always look at it that we do this throughout the life cycle of the device. That's during procurement, making sure that the device is legitimate and not been tampered with before you put it into the environment and put anything privileged on it. This also goes into monitoring and operation. what we've been talking about today. That's exactly what we do is we can connect to these BMCs with credentials and monitor them for, are they legitimate? What vulnerabilities do they have and have they been tampered with? The last piece of it is also validating that device before it gets recycled. So going into the use cases of making sure that if you try to sell that server and it has your company name configured in it, we can actually detect that in the non-volatile parts of the system before it gets retired. And ultimately just making sure that your decommissioning processes are working as expected. So, we do this. Oh, can you build that out for me?
Sure. I don't
Thank
want
you,
to click
sir.
too many times. Is that good?
No, you're
Okay.
good. That's perfect.
Okay.
So, we do this in a few different ways. You'll see on the left side the on-device scan and the on-device monitoring. That's your typical, I'll say, software-based approach within the OS, so Windows, Linux, and Mac, where we scan that system and validate the integrity of the device itself in a continuous or one-time method. So that's validation that that device is what it says it is, doesn't contain any below the operating system threats or risks, and giving you that full picture of it. You'll also see there that one that's highlighted in orange that I think kind of screwed up the build out there. Sorry about that. That's how we protect BMCs, is the agentless remote monitoring. Same thing that we do for things like switches, routers, firewalls, load balancers, and similar. We connect over management interfaces similar to something like a vulnerability management solution, except for that we do credential type of scans and interrogations to get that intelligence from them, and as well as oftentimes dig in and validate the integrity of that device and look for threats or indicators of compromise. Last piece of it is the firmware analysis side. And this is where we're getting into things like when we get that embedded Linux image from a manufacturer for whatever device is out there, we can actually do the same kind of analyses at scale through our firmware analysis piece. You upload that image, we blow it up, do things like static code analysis, software composition analysis, and binary code analysis against it to dissect and see what vulnerabilities, what weaknesses, what threats exist within those images too. Next slide, Paul.
Yeah, and I think that's twofold, and there's certainly a lot of research and engineering teams that are working on exactly this, what we call automata, right? And that will allow you to the two scenarios are I have firmware from a device that I got from a manufacturer's website that I might flash onto my device, or maybe I don't have that device, but I just want to go look and see what's inside that firmware. Are there any backdoors in there? Are there any vulnerabilities that exist in it? Then the second scenario is I can maybe take a snapshot of firmware that's running on a device. Now, your mileage will vary in difficulty as to how you do that, right? I might take certain binaries off of that system, and then be able to analyze that with our platform, and that's still evolving on our platform. I lose track of what is in production was what, because I play heavily on the research side, so I know what we're building. I'm not sure when it'll end up in there, but I know what those capabilities are, certainly at least on the very short horizon, to be able to do that. And I've been assisting the team and going like, hey, if it's a Linux binary, what do we look for? So as I've been finding things, I've been sending it over to the engineering team, and they've been building detections for, oh, if we see this, we know that's potentially malicious behavior. And this is a great level of visibility. It's not the best. I would want some facility to actually look inside these devices in real time, but short of that, this is a really good measure to look inside your firmware and detect any vulnerabilities or threats.
Oh, great call out, Paul. So, as Paul said, all of this stuff is done through what we call automata. And that's effectively our analysis engine where we built the capability to take these very hard to dissect images and analyze them at scale. And the big part of that is that we feed it with our intelligence feeds. That's things like known good. This device should be running this firmware of this
Hmm.
version and it should look this way. We can now analyze that stuff at scale operationally. Now, the output of it is where it's important for organizations where we're sending it out through our API, events and alerts out to SIM system, as well as the generation of those S bombs, F bombs, and H bombs for devices so that they can be integrated with your cyber supply chain risk management programs or solutions. So, your CSCRIM components. And all of this is really to get that transparent perspective into the equipment that is being used inside of your environment. So if you want to go to the next one, we'll take a slightly different look at the things that were mentioned, where of how we apply things. First step is getting that intelligence from the device through what we call a sensor, whether that device is a laptop, desktop, server, network infrastructure, appliance, whatever it is. We want to extract as much intelligence that that device will give us, all the way down to doing things like the spy dumps and extraction from the device itself through our proprietary drivers. And that's looking at things like TPM PCRs, UEFI, option ROMs from PCI devices, but it's also doing interrogation of things like BMCs and NICs and the drive firmwares and others. All of that data is either gathered or extracted from the device and then sent to Automata for analysis and assessment. First thing we're going to look for are things like indicators of compromise. Did we find the latest UEFI implants, backdoor, bootkit, rootkit, whatever you want to call it? Are we seeing things like compromise of the specific, attack vector within a device? This also goes into identification of both known and unknown vulnerabilities, configuration risks, tracking of change and comparisons to baseline. And then my favorite part is comparing that against known good. I can't tell you how many environments we go and find things like, I'll just say a major switch router firewall manufacturer where we find non-legitimate ones that were acquired through their supply chain and they go, yeah, I went to go get support for this when I went and called, the support company for it, and they said, yeah, we didn't actually build that switch. In those cases, it's often very enlightening for an organization to go and find that they have, counterfeit devices in their environment, and that's one of the
Right.
key things that Eclipsium focuses on is fundamentally, simply put, building trust in the devices inside of an organization.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about the assessment that we've been adding recently is not relying on malware signatures, but relying on generic detections for behavior that we can derive from, whether we've disassembled it, looked at the binary form of it, the assembly code of it, or in a lot of cases, we also go to the source code. So we decompile those binaries, and then we have rules that are like, I didn't find malware, but I found something that is like 99% or even 100%. This is only used in malicious software, and I found an indicator of that inside of your firmware. So a lot of those rules have been rolling out into our product, and I'm super excited about because this is what allows us to detect these threats in these dusty corners, as I like to call them. Well, that's good timing. 3 minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, that concludes the slide portion of the webinar today.
I would like to go ahead and thank everybody for joining us today. Wes, Paul, again, always a great session. And like I said, we did record the session and we will have the slides available to you tomorrow. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.